Hello and welcome back again to Conversations about CVI. As you know, I'm Professor John Ravenscroft from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm really pleased today that this session we're going to be talking with Professor Barry Kran from Boston. Hello, Barry.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's so good for you to be there. So currently it's about 12 minutes past 5 p.m. in the afternoon. What time have you got there?
12 minutes past noon.
All right, okay, so it's lunchtime for you, my tea time. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to ask a few questions. I'm going to change the speaker view. So for those watching on the video, it will flip so we can see Barry first. And so, Barry, please introduce yourself. Who are you and why am I talking to you?
I have no idea why you're talking to me, but I'll tell you about myself. I'm a professor of optometry at the New England College of Optometry. I've been a practicing optometrist for 34 years after completing a bachelor's in science and biochemistry, and then working for a few years, and then finally deciding that playing with beakers and test tubes were not going to be my thing. I decided to go to optometry school, which I attended in New York City. I've been married to a woman I met in college who's had her own interesting career, and together we raised two great young men who are actually engineers rather than being in the medical profession. So that's me. I've been a professor at the optometry school now, or I've been employed at the optometry school for about 18 years. Prior to that, and the optometry school again is the New England College of Optometry in Boston. And my clinical site there for the past 18 years has been the Perkins School for the Blind, New England College of Optometry Collaborative Clinic, where over my time there and especially during my time, but in the prior 18 years before I was there, we've tended to concentrate on individuals who are visually and multiply impaired. And at this point, that's all we see, are individuals who are visually and multiply impaired. 1/3 coming from the student base at the school, and 2/3 from the greater community, which is all of New England, the Northeast states, and occasionally throughout the country and the world.
All right, okay. Gosh, that sounds busy. But just one thing of clarity, Barry. What's an optometrist? In a sense, how does that differ from different fields? How does that differ from an ophthalmologist?
Yep, excellent question. And for that, I really think that I must need to give you and your audience sort of a history of the profession of optometry, because I think our history defines really where we come from and perhaps some biases that then influence how we look at individuals. So in the United States, optometry as a profession goes back to the turn of the previous century. It emerged from opticianry and became an independent profession around this time 100 years ago, like in the late teens. There's an instrument that optometrists use called the phoropter, and that's the instrument every patient hates when the optometrist goes click, which is better one, click, which is better two.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of other knobs on that machine that allow for the acquisition of a tremendous amount of data about how the visual system takes in information and how it responds to stress by adding prism and making things happen, by looking at different lenses on the impact of accommodation, the focusing system, and on the vergence system. We can play one system against another as we do this testing. So as this device became into being, it's like, well, what do you do with it? How do you collect data? What should be the way we do that? So there's a brilliant optometrist, Dr. Skeffington, around this time, a little later, came out, and he had an approach, a very rigid, specified approach to collecting data. And here in the United States, people might be familiar with something called the 21-point exam. And each data point had a number. And if you knew this shorthand, you would call each finding by its number. And the organization he ended up founding is called the Optometric Extension Program. And in there, they have a lot of education and still have a lot of education for optometrists who work and really concentrate in this realm. So early on, optometry was about how do you give a pair of glasses to somebody where it's going to be safe? How do you not have to redo those glasses? How do we give a safe prescription? And Skeffington kicked that up a notch because he realized that there's more to vision than just 20/20, right? Not everyone, if you give the best acuity to somebody, it doesn't mean it's going to be a successful prescription. And certainly we can think about if someone has a lot of astigmatism, the front part of the clear portion of the front of the eye shaped maybe more like an egg than like an orange. If you prescribe that full amount of that asymmetry in someone who previously hadn't worn glasses and say they're 10, 12, 15 years old, that full wallop at once will make them nauseous and dizzy and be unacceptable. So how do you prescribe a safe pair of glasses? And interestingly, as an aside, there's actually a book that was published in the 70s called How to Prescribe Glasses Without Making a Spectacle of Yourself. So there is an art and a science to it. But Dr. Skeffington really, what sets him apart from just getting to the bottom line of a safe pair of glasses, really thought about the impact that that prescription was having on the functioning of that person. And before we had neuroanatomical correlates in the brain, and before we had a fully formed vocabulary to describe what we come to know as now vestibular system and dorsal ventral stream and intersensory integration, he was thinking about that as he thought about how to prescribe a safe lens. He had a different vocabulary for it, but it's clear that this is what he was thinking about. And it's really, really fascinating when you go back and read that. So through his work and those that followed him, there was this, as I said, precise way of collecting data that was used. I mean, nowadays, there are probably less than a handful of optometrists in the world who collect data in exactly this fashion, but the tenets of his work are utilized by a bunch of behavioral optometrists throughout the world. And organizations such as the Optometric Extension Program and the College of Optometrist and Vision Development are two organizations dedicated to increasing our knowledge and scope of care, both of vision function and functional vision. So that just gives you a sense of where optometry was. And at that point in time, optometry in the United States was really about glasses and some basic, we couldn't use any drugs. We were not supposed to be, we were refractionists, basically, yeah. uber refractionists. And looking at some binocular vision dysfunctions and maybe even thinking about some early aspects around vision therapy. Right, so that's that. So what about me and how did I get to be an optometrist, or what does a person do in the United States to become an optometrist? You need to have an undergraduate degree, and even though I was a biochemistry major who had 25 math and science courses in my 4 years of college, I still needed to take general psychology and abnormal psychology prior to entering optometry school. It was a prerequisite. Optometry programs understand that there's a brain attached to the eye, not eyes attached to the brain. And anatomically, obviously, they're the same. They're one and the same, they're brain. But I think a key tenet difference between between ophthalmologists in general and optometrists in general is that major understanding of that difference, right? So we might see vision being more broadly defined than just acuity and field. And I think that's the difference here in the United States and in a lot of developed countries. Now, optometry, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, it's just to confirm that, obviously, as a psychologist myself, how much I would support that approach. So yes. Good on you, really, Barry. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, no, I think it's really key. And what strikes me, what struck me when I first met Dr. Dutton, and then more recently, when I had the opportunity to have more than an email conversation with Dr. Craig Hoyt here in San Francisco, was the fact that each of those individuals also came to ophthalmology from a neurology background, right? So they came brain forward, not eyes back. Yeah. And I think, again, that's why they have such a unique and powerful role in just shaping our respective professions about the role of the brain in vision and these artificial barriers that we create between whose job is what as we think about vision. And, where is vision? Where is learning? Where's psychology? Where's neuropsychology? we all need to be at the table, and we all need to be involved in the care of these kids, because the brain doesn't segregate who can help what. I think we as a community can offer the best hope. But going on back to the question of optometry, in optometry, in different parts of the world, it's like looking at optometry in the United States over the last 100 years. In some countries, optometry is something that you do some training after high school, and you're taught refraction and some very, very, very basic ocular health stuff. And that's it. You go out and you practice. And in other countries, it's part of post-high school education, university training. And in other countries, like in the United States, it's post-college. Many countries still do not allow optometrists to use therapeutic agents to treat eye disease. In the United States, in most every state, we can use ophthalmic medications to diagnose and treat pretty much every eye disease. In a few states, we're actually allowed to use lasers to do refractive surgery. Yep. And so in other countries, the use of drops is variable both diagnostically and therapeutically. And it just really depends on the lobbyists for the ophthalmologists and the needs of eye care in those communities.
Fascinating. And actually, I think you've just given me the title of my next talk, Brain Forward, Not Eyes Back. So brilliant. Absolutely. I really get that. Look, you know how much the work that I do, I work a lot with children with multiple disabilities. A lot of children with those obviously have CVI. And I'm really interested, Barry, how as an optometrist, do you assess those children, with those complex needs, complex additional support needs? I mean, that's a really tricky job, almost impossible job. You can't just, which one do you see? Is it left? Is it right? Is it red or is it green? You're just not getting those verbal responses. So I'm going to ask you, Barry, how the hell do you do that?
It's magic. So here's what I'd like to do, because, even though this is a live interview, you were fortunate to give me some of these questions ahead of time. And so what I have is, rather than talk my way through it, I've prepared a few slides here where we can go through some of those things. And first, I think I'd outline our approach to care, because that is the basic tenet for it all, and then show you some videos of how, in fact, we do what we do, and some of the gadgets and toys we use and all of that. Okay, does that work for you?
It works for me. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to press pause on the recording, and then we'll come back when you're all ready. Okay. So welcome back, everyone. We've got this, the slides back up, and we were just marveling at the use of technology. So Barry's over there in Boston, and I'm here in Edinburgh, and we're just marveling at how well we can do this. So Barry, as I was saying, I'm really interested in the assessment of children with multiple disabilities and children with CVI. So over to you.
All right, great. And I think we've already talked about optometry and some of the history and the differences, and relative to your question now, I think we could move on to our next slide here, where for the last 18 years, as I said, I've been working at our clinic at the Perkins School for the Blind. And two of the people that I've had the most contact with is Derek Wright for about 15 or maybe 14 of the years I was there, and the same with Dr. Mayer, although I'm still working with Dr. Louisa Mayer, who is a vision scientist, PhD, has had an incredible career. She worked with Davida Teller developing the Teller Acuity cards, and she's been at Children's Hospital Boston for about 25 years, where she developed this unique pediatric visual field perimetry device. And we've worked together now on developing some contrast cards for collection of contrast on kids who are not visually impaired and have multisensory issues. Derek Wright is an orientation mobility specialist and an educator at the UMass Boston School, where he teaches an online program throughout New England and in different countries. to become either an orientation mobility specialist or a teacher of the visually impaired. And they actually are working with some other collaborative arrangements to work with VR people as well. So Voc Rehab. So when I first came to Perkins, Derek and I were the ones who were there. And even though I had had a good amount of time working with people with some differences, I was really not ready to run with this. I've always been open-minded. I've always thought a little bit out of the box. But working with this population takes an awful lot of thinking out of the box, and it could be daunting at times. So I was really fortunate for the first couple of few years to have Derek in the room with me, and sometimes our creative juices would just all of a sudden we'd out of nowhere come up with, let's try this and see what happens. And then we would, after the exam, sit and think about what was it that made that happen, and as we thought about how do we teach people this, it just can't be, well, it's just magic and it happens. We have to sort of legitimize it, and legitimize is the wrong word, but is there a way of formalizing what we do? And so hopefully over these next bunch of slides, we can talk about some of the ways that we've been able to grow and learn around that. And currently I work with also Nicole Ross, who's an amazing young optometrist. And she pretty much runs our low vision service at the college, and has been working now at Perkins for at least 5 years, and has come a super long way around working with kids with visual and multiple impairments. Each of our liaisons for the various programs at Perkins have also been helpful. And when you think about if you are an eye care provider who are going to be working with this population, if you can have people who come to your appointment who are familiar with that child and has a sense of educationally what's going on, they can really be a resource and for you to help get through the exam safely. We always let our parents know, and those who know the child know, as we're working with the child, if there's something that they think we can do better that'll get the child to give us, to cooperate and collaborate, we need to know that. If we're not quick enough to pick up subtle changes in their body language before they get a behavioral outburst, they need to let us know. So it's really, really important that we set the stage and we use the resources available to us to have a successful exam.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more in the sense, I can agree with you more in the sense that, that knowledge of the parent, that knowledge of the QTVI, of the carer, of those liaison teams who really know the children, and working together with specialists such as yourself, I think is really important point there. So I'm really glad you made that, Barry. Great. Sorry for interrupting. Carry on.
No, not at all. I think that at our clinic, our roles vary. Sometimes we are the one and only eye care provider for our patients, and sometimes we are essentially consultants in that link between vision, eye care, and education. And so we try to make sure that our reports address all of those needs as needed for any given patient. And we try to write our reports, so we'll have all our data in data language, but then when it comes time to put it all together, we'll put all of that in English understanding so that hopefully the patients can understand it, educators can understand it, and other medical professionals or educational professionals who read it understand that we have some sense of what we're talking about. So it's that balance of language with explanations of words that we use, and then provide and segregate our report in those findings with useful information. So we often give, here's the acuity, here's the contrast, here's the visual field, here's this, that, and the other thing. Okay, what does this all mean? Is this all explainable by an ocular visual impairment? Is it not? What do we think about that individual's nystagmus? And what does that mean for acuity? And does it explain the whole show? Or is there something else going on? Is it brain-based? What did the survey that we did point out? What during our evaluation also confirms that? What allows us to then give that diagnosis? So that's what we are thinking about. We're thinking about what's going to be the outcome of the exam before we even walk in.
Right. Okay. Good. Excellent. Good. All right.
All right, and here, just to illustrate a key point, a lot of our patients, as you were saying, John, it's like, how do I examine them? Really, well, let's think about it from the parent's perspective. Oh my God, I've got this child with all these issues, and here we don't have a national health service, but you can see here in this color-coded diagram with one of our patients with vision and multiple impairments, all the resources that she, the parent, who's now essentially the general contractor for this kid's life, is trying to manage this situation with medical professionals, the health industry, the healthcare insurance side, all the specialists, medical specialists, educational specialists, setting up services for this kid beyond the time that the parents will be able to provide. It's just extraordinarily daunting. And
Yeah.
many of us have managed, simple projects in our house, like a kitchen renovation or something, and we know how completely out of control that can go. This is, just orders of magnitude, much more
Oh,
complex than that.
absolutely. I mean, I've given a talk just outlining the 32 professionals a parent can just meet along the child's journey, and you've got to manage those. And we're trying to, streamline the system here in Scotland where you don't have to keep repeating the same information, but just managing the diary, getting to these places. And, that's why we're big supporters of the single shared assessments and these roles here. But I think that's a great image you've got on the screen here. Just that it's a really clear example of just that complexity parents have faced on and through that child's journey. And when I give my talk, I only talk about the professionals. Here, it's really nice that you've got the charity part of it. You've got the early interventionist, the play group, the other side of things as well. So it really demonstrates for me clearly just the complexity of supporting children with complex needs. Excellent.
All right, so I've already talked a little bit with you, John, about the mindset of us before we go in and see the patient. And I think probably the key point here is a little further explanation of the last point, vision function and functional vision, something that we had mentioned earlier. Right, so vision function to me is things like acuity, eye pressure, real numbers, data. And often you think about those numbers equaling how the child functions. And certainly classically, that's the definition of blindness, right? It revolves around a number being worse than, or their field in some places being smaller than a certain amount, right? But what we find, unfortunately, with CVI, what blows this out of the water, this approach, is that many people with some forms of CVI might have quite excellent acuity in most testing paradigms, and yet can't process the information to safely travel through space, to recognize simple forms, letters, people's faces, etc. So functionally, they can be certainly visually impaired, if not functioning at the level of legal blindness or worse.
Sure.
And so this is the task before us, to ferret out during the exam. All right, so we know about this, trying to read through all this information before we see a patient to get a sense, mentioned before about brain forward, not eyes backwards. We have to not only see the patient, the joke is optometrists or eye care providers see these big eyes attached to a minuscule body. And, at this point, I'm probably accused of seeing this big brain, small eyes attached to a body. But in essence, though, we really need to think about who is this person? What are all the aspects around this person that makes them who they are? And as best as and as unbiasedly as possible, what can we ascribe in the visual domain, broadly defined, whether it's more traditional ocular-based impairments or more of a brain-based vision impairment.
I noticed on the slide here, and you might go through it there, your pre-evaluation stage there, but you've got listed there your CVI surveys. It's quite encouraging, I guess, for people to know that professionals such as yourself do use these history-taking kind of surveys, these history developing understanding about the child, this holistic view of the child, using these kind of surveys, whether they're developed. It doesn't really necessarily mind who developed them. I have a talk where I present 5 or 6 different versions of different types of CVI surveys, and as you know, I've got a paper about those. But it's really quite interesting to see how you would use these, and encouraging. Would you take these? Would you ask the questions themselves, or would you get someone else, or would you send it to the parents in advance? How would that work for you?
It's in patients broadly defined, it's some combination of all of the above. In some cases, it might be that they come in because they've been assessed. They've had an academic, here in the United States, they've had an academic assessment for CVI, right? So in the United States, it's eye doctors generally who diagnose CVI from a medical perspective, but from an educational assessment point of view, and to a degree here, we're splitting hairs, but it's an important point. They'll come up with a functional sort of academic diagnosis based on the results. That is, they, meaning teachers of the visually impaired, orientation mobility specialists, will come up with that diagnosis, educational diagnosis, based on the results of some of their testing. And currently, the one that most educators are using in United States, North America, is the Roman survey. So the CVI range, as it's more formally known. And so it's not infrequent at this point in time, though 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was exceedingly rare for us to have one of those assessments that had been done, say, in the prior year. So we'll review that, certainly, but then we'll often, if not always, augment that with some other particular survey, either one that we are finding as a favorite flavor of ours in the clinic at that point in time, or one we're test driving, or whatever it might seem, and is also obviously most appropriate for the parent. You know, so there was a survey that was put together by a physical therapist out of Israel maybe 6 years ago. That seems to be a great survey to use on extremely low functioning kids, who have some significant motor issues. And so we use that at this point very occasionally. We've used the Ortibus survey. She doesn't like to refer to it that way. I think it's called the Flemish, more fully the Flemish CVI survey. So we'll use that at times. And we've used Dr. Dutton's inventory a lot as well. And it just really depends. And I think the key point for us relative to these surveys, it does not make a diagnosis. And this, you know, some people are going to disagree perhaps with some of these points that I'm about to make, but I know certainly Gordon doesn't, Dr. Dutton. And I do not look for a criteria number of affirmed behaviors consistent with CVI to say, okay, you're over the threshold, you're in. Because I believe that there are people with various forms of CVI who may only have but a few of those deficits, but those deficits can be so severe that it is extraordinarily disabling. And just because they don't, just because they don't reach a criteria of a % of findings doesn't mean they don't have that diagnosis.
Sure. And I think that's the issue. We talked a little bit about, within the history of optometry, that if you just go by a number-based system, then you go by a number-based system, and there will be a line within that as well. So you're taking all of this information and you're just looking holistically, I guess, from the child as well. One final point before we move on from this slide, I think, is I'm particularly, again, encouraged because, I train and educate teachers of learners with visual impairment, that you you welcome their reports, you welcome their expertise, because there's a little, I think certainly in the UK, and again, I might be wrong about this, there may be some hesitancy in going to an optometrist or going to an ophthalmologist and going, listen, I really think for these reasons, this child may or may not have CVI, but look, I've noticed they can't do this, this, and this. But you actually, as a professional, would welcome that kind of report.
Absolutely. I think it's important. And for, everyone knows in their community, probably who are the eye doctors that are a little more open into hearing what is said, right? So the more experienced the vision educators are at seeing these reports or going and attending visits, they find out who's more open. And I think educating those that are more open in a very respectful way is important. And sometimes that could be rather than, maybe sharing the full report, but perhaps providing a summary of the key bullet points if they don't have time to read that full report could be helpful. Here are things that are out of the ordinary that I think the previous eye diagnoses may not be explaining. Bing, 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 bing. And that could be enough to say, okay, there might be something going on here. How to turn on a doctor who is not interested in delving into vision in this way? I wish I had a great answer for that. Some you might be able to turn on, but I think the vast majority are going to find this just too daunting. I mean, it's a constant learning curve. I spent probably the first half of my professional career in a traditional, quasi-traditional eye care practice. I did regular eye exams. I took care of people with various eye diseases, and I did vision therapy on about a third of my practice, and a third was contact lenses. And I saw some people with visual and multiple impairments in my practice. But, after a while, 20 times a day saying, which is better, one or two, or you have your routine of doing things, is sometimes many people find that rewarding. Me, I was getting bored and I wanted to be challenged. And this definitely does that, but it needs to be understood that it's not for everyone, but these parents are so struggling to find an explanation for how their kids can see. And if you can find a doctor resource, an eye care provider who can relate to the parents and their desire to get that information is just so powerful and so rewarding for everyone, for the entire community.
All right, cool, interesting, good.
All right, so all of this goes into it, and we get the history, and here are some simple things that people might be asking. What does my child see? Is there a problem with their peripheral or side vision? How could we improve the use of vision for things like activities of daily living? What should the size of their symbols be on their communication system? What about for learning? Other issues that might be going on. And how many symbols should be on a screen for their communication system?
Sure.
So you were asking about surveys, and here you are. And so there's the Israeli survey that I commented on earlier, and then of course Dutton's and Ordubus's and survey. And we use the survey, I think, in the way that Gordon ideally hoped that the inventory would be used. We use it to direct the history at times. So there might be times where I'll ask informally these questions or ones similar to them.
Yeah.
And get a hint of what's going on. I'll have my fourth year students and residents start collecting some information, and together we're all in the room, we're watching, we're seeing what's going on, and watching the child's behaviors, and are they starting to crash? Why are they crashing? What's with their behaviors about the way they're reading things or the way they're interacting, the need for breaks, the latency, etc. Then I'll go, okay, there's more going on here. And then I might grab a Teach CVI survey, which I didn't have on that other screen. Depending upon the level the kid is at, I'll get the respective survey, hand it to mom and dad, and say, fill that out, and we'll talk more. And then if the vision teacher's there, I'll give them their own survey and say, okay, you do that one, and don't talk. I want this independent of each other. and we'll compare the results afterwards. And then that could set up, as I then sort of coalesce the information. What did they tell me in their survey responses? What did we see during the exam? And we'll probably, I'll get to how we collect the data in a second. And then it'll prompt me to ask more questions, which then can lead to really great ideas for advocacy. Oftentimes, the more and more that I'm seeing this population, the fewer tests I find myself doing, and the more the probing and the history and the conversation with the parents are critical in coming up with the correct advocacy for that individual and services. I don't know if others have told you that too, John.
Yeah, really interesting. The more they get to know, the more you understand the child there as well. It's almost a less formal testing that you're going to do. Quite important. Good. Hey,
right.
man,
And
I'm loving this, Barry. This is great.
You're welcome. I'm enjoying chatting with you. I think, John, you've heard me talk about this as well, but as being new to Perkins, I saw a child there in one of the programs, and I wrote this report, and in it, next to a couple of findings, I put uncooperative. And the liaison to that program pulled me aside, and obviously we had established a relationship where she was comfortable saying this to me, and she was very careful about how she said it. But when you pare away all the nicety, she was like, "Barry, what are you doing? This kid busted his butt for this exam. He was awesome. You were awesome in getting him to give you all this information. He's never done this before. I really don't think it's fair for mom and dad to see this report where it says he was uncooperative. He wasn't." And, it just gave me sort of the chills and the hair on the back of my neck raised. And it was like, you're absolutely right. You are completely and 100% correct. It's really sort of, no pun intended, myopic on the part of the eye care provider to be thinking that the world or the exam revolves around the doctor. It really doesn't. It's not that the patient is uncooperative, but the issue is that it's really the doctor's inability to create an environment in which the patient can be successful. And a corollary to that is it's not only how one introduces or models and adapts a technique, but when one performs the technique during the exam that will ultimately determine one's success in acquiring that information. So if you had to put it down to a bullet point, it's performing the right test at the right time in the right way.
Brilliant. Good.
All right, so the next slide here, and I think perhaps the next couple, sort of demonstrate that. So one of the ways that we collect acuity are certainly you can use standard symbols, letters or numbers, and then if they don't know their letters but know basic shapes, we could then collect Leia type symbols of acuity. And here we have an example where we did forced choice matching using the Leia playing cards. And you can see the Leia playing cards are various cards, and there are 8 of them that go from a large symbol size of 16M all the way down to 0.63M. And here's an example of an isolated symbol on a card. And so we had our intern presenting this to one of the children with her teacher nearby, and she was shy, and there were times where she wasn't speaking, so we gave her the opportunity to reply from this choice of 4 over here. And so here, I think I should be able to play it. All right, so let's going to stop that. So, and it goes on, and ultimately we get a threshold acuity. So in this case, we actually had the child's teacher there in the background. I actually heard the liaison's voice as well. So, God, she was really young there. I think she graduates this year from Perkins actually, and so. Just as just a wonderful example. And there are times where we only have to use forced choice matching, where we show 1, but they choose from a field of 2. And of course, well, they can be right 50% of the time, right? So you need to make sure that they're not guessing along with you. So when you present both the card and the response. It can't always be left, right, left, right. You have to go in sort of a random arrangement, and you need to collect enough of them so that you're sure that they're not getting into a guessing game with you. And with some experience, you know, I can't say that I'm never fooled, but I like to believe that I'm rarely fooled on that.
Yeah. Yeah, those odds are good 50-50. Yeah, you got to watch out for those biases as well, isn't it? That unconscious bias of presenting those cards as well is a little trick as well.
Well, and that is um, overwhelmingly so with any of the preferential looking tests. So I like drill into my students. I get extremely upset if they look at the teller cards before they present it to the child. I was like, nope, 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 give me the card, turn around. I rotate the card, so I don't know where it is either. I hand it back to the student. I say, now present it. I refuse to allow them to know where the stripes are. It's only the patient that should know. And I even try to, if I see the intern student looking at even the mother's eyes to determine where the stripes are, I'll say, no, you can't look at her eyes either. You've got to look at the kid's eyes and the kid's head. And are they making a head turn to it? Is it a true fixation? What's going on? Are they cross-fixating if they're with eyes crossed, anisotrope, using the right eye for left gaze and vice versa? So there's a lot to think about when you're using those preferential looking cards. And you're right, if I knew where the stripe or the shape was on any of those cards, all my kids would see 20/20.
Yeah,
so yeah, no,
that's right.
no,
Yeah,
can't happen. Bad news, very bad. This is a situation where a kid would make such brief looks for teller cards, it was impossible for us to tell. And so we collected a functional acuity here. So turns out it was the same teacher, but different time. And I'm going to play this. I might probably reduce the sound and speak over it. Let's see what we have here. Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to do. So he's trying to look, and we just have, notice we had the lights turned off except for on the card in a way to reduce the visual complexity and try to gain his visual attention. And to us, it was clear this was like the third or fourth time we had seen him, and within a few months, he was a new student at Perkins. We had no real history on him other than he was blind. And his teacher was emphatic that he in fact had some vision, and it was clear to me he did, because he was being passively aggressive about not paying attention. We'd hold something up and he'd purposely look away.
sure.
You know, he's like, yeah, I'm not playing this game. There's nothing in it for me. I've got no skin in the game here. So ultimately, it was one of those aha moments. It's like, you know, how many times can you do the same thing and expect a different outcome? And so we thought, well, we had these little round Cheerio things, we call them in the United States, these little round cereal things. And we had a little bag of them, and we ultimately then presented them, and you can see on these different contrasting backgrounds. And we knew how big the Cheerio is, and we knew the distance that he saw it in, if in fact his arms were long enough to reach it at threshold. That we don't know. So this could be more of a contrast than an acuity test. But you notice that he saw them immediately, and he saw them on the black side, not on the beige side. So that was beige on beige and beige on black.
Yeah. Look at that.
So the question here is it the contrast, or does he have a left field defect?
Deficit, right? That's right. Yeah.
So we take it back, we flip it around, and here we go. And so clearly he does not have a left field defect. And he felt that one in the bottom left-hand corner on the beige side, but what does he go to? Does he go to the one he felt? No, he goes to the ones he saw of higher contrast. And then it's like, yep, I know that one's there, so I'll get that one next. And then what?
Is he going to do a search, or is he just going to, okay, well, that's it. Look at that.
Yeah, so it's like it doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. And this was an extraordinarily powerful, can you hear me okay, John? I had to turn down the volume.
Yeah,
right,
no, absolutely fine. Yeah, you were good.
Okay, good. So what this was so affirming for the teacher. It validated for her that this individual does have some useful vision, and it, you know, changed what they did for him in the cottage. They made sure that that everything was with high contrast. His food was presented with high contrast. He didn't have a white toothbrush in a white bathroom. You know, he'd never find his toothbrush, that kind of thing. If they had mashed potatoes, it wasn't on a white plate, or if it was, maybe you put some beef gravy on it or something. So there's some contrast. You could see that there's something there. And that carried through to all aspects of how they organized his clothes, what happened in the classroom. And it just made him happier because he was more able to engage with the environment around him, and made him more open for education and for life in general.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really good example as well. I was just thinking there, you know, what do we have on our you know, the paper we use or the screens? It's sometimes always white there, you know, and we just really need to think about that contrast as well. Excellent, really good example there. I like that. Yeah, so I might use this part of the video several times in the different talks as well.
Okay.
So thanks for that,
Sounds good.
Barry.
All right. All right. Just think of me when you do so. All
Yeah.
right. So here we go. So over here, you mentioned contrast, and here we are with some other ways of
Yeah.
looking at contrast. So what is available is the hiding Heidi, and that has some strengths and weaknesses, but it's certainly very affordable, and a way of at least screening. You clearly know what side has the shape and what side doesn't, so there's some bias there, but again, you have it. What Dr. Mayer primarily, and myself and a few others, have been working on over the last few years, and we have a paper that we're doing hopefully a final revision on before finally being fully accepted, on this thing called the double happy contrast cards. And so what we've created here is a card that, instead of 55 centimeters in diameter, like the teller cards, are 40 centimeters, which is at least an optometric standard working distance in the United States. But obviously your kids can be taller or shorter and be at different distances. But it's 40 centimeters, so you have your test distance already built in. And on one side you have a face, whether you have it, whether this face is on this side of the card or you rotate it and now it's on that side. Either way, it still looks like the same face. It's a more uniform set of
I see what you
contrasting
mean. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
materials than the hiding Heidi. And there's no bias if you don't look at the card ahead of time of presenting it to the patient. And so we have a series of cards that we use that will give a contrast. Now, teller cards or any grading acuity and contrast using this really just require them to know that something is there, right? It's not the same thing as telling you the correct letter, like in a contrast, in a typical contrast like Pelly Robson or one of the others. You have to read letters or symbols or things. And when you get a couple incorrect, you're done. The ones you got incorrect, you still knew there was a symbol there. You just incorrectly identified it. So for this, that's not the case. So what happens is sometimes for both acuity and or contrast, these grading or these sort of detection rather than recognition tasks can overestimate the ultimate acuity or the ultimate level of contrast. But at least for the acuity, we have norms, well-documented norms, and you understand that sometimes it can overestimate, and occasionally dramatically so. But that's fortunately relatively rare, and as long as you have that caveat and you're aware of it, I think it's still extraordinarily important, useful clinical information to have as a guidepost, even albeit perhaps a relative guidepost.
Just yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and then the experience comes within to that as well. I was just thinking as well of how so these modified cards, they're just within your clinic. You can't buy these. These are just what you've developed.
That's true, and our hope is hopefully within a year they'll be available. That would be our guess. That's my guess, my hope.
Oh, okay. Well, when they are, let me know, and I'll let others know, and I'll tag it to this. Yeah, yeah. Cool, good.
Okay. All right. And totally different, but we'll just spend a second on, about tools, techniques, gadgets that we use that the general population may not do about a vision function finding. And this is eye care, tonometry for measuring eye pressure. And these eye care tonometers have been game changing within eye care. This was part of a case that we had where this kid had large cups and was being followed for glaucoma to rule out glaucoma from the time he was born. Forward, we saw him as a 16-month-old, and we got this pressure, and I don't necessarily, I don't necessarily, I don't believe that though they were being followed at this point, eye care was relatively a new tonometer and not that available.
Right.
In fact, one of these pediatric clinics, ophthalmology clinics, didn't have it. We had one, they didn't. And we had this normal pressure, but they had the VEP and some other information. And it was like, and we had a birth history, and it was like, this kid had retrograde axonal degeneration and therefore large cups. I mean, it just was consistent. And ultimately we had to cite the paper, the Jacobson paper, where she discovered this, and had to educate the ophthalmologist that's the more likely explanation for the large cups rather than pediatric glaucoma. But it's important that they be, that they get watched and that you're sure that it's the brain-based reason for it and not necessarily elevated pressure. But surprisingly, I think still in this day and age, there are a lot of eye care providers who don't think about that differential diagnosis with large cup to disc ratios. And now that we have an easily accessible way of collecting eye pressure, it should be something that should be thought of, and then ultimately be able to reduce the frequency with which you need to see these kids. And because there's no reason to, once you put everything together and get a sufficient number of findings.
Yeah, sure. Good. Interesting. Yeah. And it's really, and I guess it is using those tools that you've got there. I'm just looking at these, that's coming on the next slide. Enable to distinguish that is to have that differential diagnosis, to be able to do that differential diagnosis and to work out, well, actually, yes, this might be something standardized in terms of, could be glaucoma or something, but it could actually just be this brain-based cause. So it's great that they're coming along stream now, being more sophisticated and being used within your types of clinics.
Yes, and I think also I'm seeing greater and greater use of handheld OCT devices, ocular coherence tonometry devices, to also be imaging the back of the eye and getting a sense of what's happening retinally. And then Jacobson also pointed out in her paper, I think in 2016, pointed out that when she went back and looked at those same subjects that she reported on in the 90s, the OCT findings of retinal thickness deficits, et cetera, totally matched, areas of the brain that were impacted, or the visual pathway that was impacted with the damage. So you actually have the marker of the brain damage in the eye through the the retrograde axonal degeneration. Yeah. Not always 100%, not always all the time, obviously, but the fact that there is that there can be that consistency is striking. And we'll get back to fields in a few minutes, but other gadgets that we sometimes think about, we don't have time to do during our evaluation, even though it's typically over an hour that we spend, to do formalized visual perceptual assessments or visual motor evaluations. And kids, they've been doctored to death, a lot of them. So we don't wear our coats, we don't wear ties. We're in a school-based clinic, right? So it's a school, it's not a hospital. So we find that we get valuable information, though not standardized, from simple things like puzzles. And this was pulled from a case, and these puzzles were no problem. But for some kids, a puzzle like this, we had a case where the kid was able to put in one or two of these and then was lost. Well, actually, it was this puzzle right here. Was able to put in one or two of these pieces and then was just like blown away. And then what I did was I covered these 6 with a white sheet of paper, and then he was very quickly able to fill these back in. Right. And then I covered this, and then he was able to. So that clearly showed that the complexity of the situation was too much for him, or he couldn't put together all of that space. So whether it was simultagnasia or complexity, you know, we can argue about whether it was one or the other, but we simplified the presentation, and then the child was more able to complete it. And probably the most complex one is this, or hardest one. You can see in this picture here that it's really difficult to see the outline of the shape here, right? There are minimal cues. And then the child sees the picture, the puzzle discombobulated, and they have to put it together. And it's striking to watch the way they do that. Not only from a visual, you know, perspective, but a visual motor perspective. Do they use lead and support? Do they have their supporting hand to help with this? Are they tactily feeling what's going on here and tactily matching? Are they paying attention to the subtle visual cues in some of these shapes? For example, this shape is often put in, it's sort of, the piece here is wider at this point than it is here, and is often simply inserted upside down over here, the body of the cow. But if you look carefully, you see that there's some red and green over here that matches the barn, which doesn't exist at the bottom. Yet very often they don't see that. Some of the kids cannot put together this face. They don't understand that that's a face. And then well, do they recognize mom and dad? No. So it's fascinating what you can pick up with these subtle puzzles.
Right, and we've all got those. You know, we've all got those puzzles. Yeah. Easy to get.
And what was fascinating a few years ago, when I was fortunate enough to be able to spend some time visiting with other places around the world who work with kids with CVI, I was at 2 schools for the blind in Belgium, both in the Flemish regions. And they each had people who independently, so here we are at Perkins in our silo, and here are these other 2 schools in their relative silos. And they each had people there, not necessarily eye doctors, but other people who were involved with the vision clinic, who had rooms full of this kind of stuff. And we were all doing independently recreating the wheel with these informal assessment tools to figure out things like this. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take them and put on vision testing on the title and charge 5 times as much.
There you go. You sound like a typical American now. Let's monetize this.
That's right. Let's monetize this. Let's put CVI on it. All right. Okay, good.
All right, so visual fields, right? So Leia has her own wand here, which is a pretty decent product. It's a very small, it has a couple of different types of brightness to the light, and it will flash or be on constantly, and she'll use this independently. It's got this flexible thing, and you can go to her website, or in the United States here, Good Light, and there are links to videos and show you how she uses that. We had a former student resident, and now a colleague. He works at a health center in Boston, who he and his dad's an electrical engineer, created what we call, because his last name is Kang wands. And he'd be very embarrassed to hear his name being used with this, but we have these Kang wands, and it's a flickering light that could flicker at 1 or 2 different frequencies. And the diameter of it is pretty similar to the diameter of the ball that was used with the ROP studies. They used an arc perimeter. And so we tried to sort of match that, one of those sizes. And so we use this, we could use it in either a forced choice kind of way, where we hold one in each hand in a very dim room, and I'll only turn on one or the other while the patient's looking at my face, and we'll try to get a sense of their field. And this is a super threshold target. So it's a very bright light in a very dark room. In a typical individual, or an individual with typically full fields, like if we were to do this on one of you, you would almost see those lights, if I was to hold them even slightly behind your visual axis itself, you would see it almost behind your eyes. It's so bright. So we can tell, what I generally will record is grossly full, present, or maybe constricted. And I'll look in different quadrants. And I'll often need to do repeated measures, over the course of time before I'm really comfortable saying this is what it is. And we only use this when other forms of testing, more quantifiable forms of testing, are not available.
And would you do it at like at different times of the day as well, or is it just when they come to clinic? Because many teachers report to me that either, an afternoon might be a good time for the child, but generally, the child is really tired in the afternoon, so they test in the morning. So do you do variable testing, or do you try, or is it just you don't have that luxury? It's just when the children come to clinic.
I don't generally have that luxury. There are times though where I'll say well, at this point, I mean, we're booked out so far. So I'll say when you come back next year, if I'm concerned about something like that, instead of an afternoon appointment, let's try a morning appointment. But I'll
No,
always ask as part of a history question, is today a good day or a bad day? Right?
yeah,
You have so many kids with seizures, and are they being controlled? Are they not controlled? And sometimes you see dramatic changes just, on either a good day or if they're well controlled medically for other reasons.
no, good, interesting.
Didn't talk about. So recently I was fooled, and I think it's important to point out. So we did Kongwans on a patient and a young guy who I'd seen a couple of other times. This particular time though, when I was out in the waiting room, and this time I went to go shake his hand, it seemed like it took him a bit to find my hand, even though I felt it was clearly in his visual field. And so that alerted me right away that maybe there's something going on here. And then when I did the Kongwan fields, he was like scanning all over the place and nonstop scanning. And it wasn't, I didn't renote that as being as a significant issue in the past. And, um, and the dad had reported all these things that really raised the flag about, is there CVI here? Forget about a very constricted visual field. And so we had the parents complete a survey, and there were enough findings there that and plus the verbal history that made me think that maybe there's CVI, and we can advocate for that and the accommodations around that, but we need to have this kid back for formal field testing. So we had the kid back for formal field testing, and here's what Dr. Mayer found. I mean, this is a tiny field. This is a
Yeah,
less
yeah,
than a
yeah.
20 degree field. So does this kid truly have CVI? No, this kid has a tiny field. And all of his behaviors, why he can't in a dynamic environment, why he's completely discombobulated, makes sense. Why, when things aren't put away in a particular place, it explains why he gets ticked off and frustrated. Why he can't find, if you don't put his pajamas in a specific place on his bed, why he can't find them, right? Some of these behaviors, though, do overlap with findings you see in CVI. And so as eye doctors, we need to think about, is it consistent with the level of, if you will, brain-based vision impairment, even though this visual field deficit is likely because of a cone rod dystrophy that the community ophthalmologist hasn't been aggressive about diagnosing. But could it also be a brain-based reason? So we need to figure this out, and we need to figure this out soon. But this is an example where you have to have the complete picture before one should be comfortable making this type of diagnosis.
Yeah, and you just can't go on behaviors, I think, is an
No.
interesting point, isn't it? Yeah, because the behaviors suggest this, and now when you do a formal Goldman here, you think, well, actually, that would be now we have to understand, like you say, why the field is so small here. But you could easily imagine that. I can imagine this child, in their behaviors, and even probably around with objects as well, and faces, and you would tick that box and go, yep, that, if it looks like CVI and it smells like CVI, that it's going to be CVI. But clearly, this is not. This is a really good example of why it's not just survey based, why we do need examination based, why we do need experts like yourself to really look at this. So great example for that.
Yep. And then, if people want more about what we've done around this stuff, this is a talk that I did on CVI that's at the cyber site Orbis. And this is a series of videos that we did for how to evaluate people with visual and multiple impairments. And it shows people it shows a pediatric ophthalmologist evaluating a couple of adults with Down syndrome, and then our conversations around various aspects of their care, including cataract care. And then there's a talk by an optometrist who was groundbreaking. He was the first optometrist hired at a tertiary care ophthalmology practice in Boston. He was the first optometrist to ever be hired at any of the three ones we have in Boston. And he talks about how to do refraction in this population. And then there's a talk by a physician who is a developmental pediatrician and also a mother of a child with autism, and her exploration to find answers for how her child sees and the kind of care that she would hope to get from an eye care provider. So there are those links if those who are interested. And I'm sure, John, you have a bunch of other links besides these, but
Yeah.
that you often refer to, and more. And then I think, yeah, this is the end of what I thought about the gadgets and some questions that I knew you'd be asking about. So what I'll do here is I'll just stop sharing slides. I think I got to quit the presentation.
And then stop sharing.
Yep, and then give you back control.
All right, yeah.
There you go.
There we go. I have now control again. So I enter full screen, and there we, oh, excellent. Well, look, Barry, look, this is, for those who don't know, this is the Thursday before Good Friday. You've given up a lot of your time to talk through this. I've learned huge amounts, and I know a lot about this field. So I really want to say thank you very much. Is there anything you want to say, Barry? Is there anything you want to say or ask me or anything really?
No, I think, well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to allow me to share what it is that we do. I think the more people that have this information and know what's possible could maybe find people in their own local communities. That would be my hope, and I know it's your hope, that can add to the quality of care of the individuals with brain-based vision impairment.
All right.
And whether it's brain-based vision impairment or not, to aid to the functional adaptation and the abilities to meet their needs and to have a bigger toolbox through which to collect that information and understand it and utilize it is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, your video, along with the others that I'm doing, are all part of just a small part of those toolbox to help not only ourselves as professionals to understand the roles that we do, but for the parents and hopefully the children as well, as they get to grow up and understand, you know, what is cerebral visual impairment? Do I have it? Do I not have it? Is it that differential diagnosis that we need to do? But excellent. It's been a real privilege to listen to you this afternoon, Barry. I've absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it. Top man. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much.